Today I'm going to be going over the significations of the houses. If a transit is going on in a specific house, you can start to understand what you can expect to manifest as that happens. And by the way, this chart that I'm using is the Thema Mundi, which is the birth chart of the world. In general, it is not a good idea to start out learning astrology through equating first house with Aries, second house with Taurus, etc. It limits you in the fact that most people's charts are not actually set up that way. So you can fall into the trap of telling them about their first house as if it was Aries. But even though it does have some of those archetypal qualities, let's just stick to the signs that are actually on those houses. And there are many different ways of dividing up the houses in different systems, such as Placidus, whole sign, Porphyry. I use whole sign because that's what I learned. I don't think there's a best one to use. The best one to use is the one that you learn and are comfortable using, and that's really all that matters. What we're looking at is essentially the horizon. If you're a person who is standing on Earth and you look to the east horizon will be where things are rising. So whatever zodiac sign is over there is the rising sign. So when you were born, there was something on the eastern horizon. So that's what we call the ascendant sign, which in the Thema Mundi is Cancer. The sign that was on the east colors your first house. So the qualities of that sign will inform your self. And what do we mean by self? Well, there are lots of different selves, but the main thing to remember is that we are infinite indestructible consciousness, which is having a human experience. And where do you find the infinite indestructible consciousness in the chart? You don't, because it's beyond the chart. The chart informs your incarnate existence here on Earth and the kind of experiences and archetypal energies that you're going to be susceptible by and led with, and the circumstances which you may find yourself in. But there is something that is beyond this existence. I think the chart is very helpful to help you figure out how to navigate the world here and now. But there's another much greater aspect of you that you could just kind of think of as outside of time and space that you're infinitely connected to. And just the awareness of that will help to take the chart a little less seriously, because as infinite and indestructible, we are all a part of the whole kind of creation, or whatever you want to call it, for yourself. The chart is an aspect of you on Earth, and the first house is that plug-in. It's where you, the spirit, meets the incarnate body. So the first house has a lot to say about your physicality, so the way you look. If the first house is the plug-in to this incarnate world and it informs things about your body, a lot of people say that it's like the mask being the surface of who you are. So how you come off to others, how others see you, how you see yourself in this world, is dictated by the first house. It's the essential you. There are other things that inform who you are. Well, the whole chart informs who you are. But for example, the sun in the chart informs more on like a soul level, where your focus is going to be in life. But the ascendant sign, I don't know if I would call it a mask, but it is kind of the first layer of how you come across or how you interact with the world around you. The other thing you can look at is if your first house is Cancer or something else, whatever it is. One of the reasons why I prefer whole sign houses is because it's not going to be half Gemini, it's not going to be half Leo, it's just going to be that whole sign. What will tell you a lot about the first house and your essential self will be where the ruler of that house is and what the ruler is doing. And you can see here that the ruler is the moon. If you have a Cancer rising with the moon in Cancer, that means your moon is in rulership. If it is somewhere else, then you can see where it is, and based on that house, it will tell you where a lot of the energy is going to go in your life. So if the ruler of your first is in the 11th, you may have a lot of friends and network. If the ruler of your first is in the 7th, relationships would be a major focus in your life. So if the first house is self, the 7th house is other. The 7th house is generally considered about partnerships, like romantic partnerships, but it could be clients or people who you have a one-on-one relationship with. And I think that there are a lot of houses that stand for friends. Usually it's considered to be the 11th house. However, I think you can find friends all over the chart depending on what kind of friends they are. And in the 7th, it's the type of relationships that are intimate and are experienced mostly one-on-one. And that doesn't exclude friends or anyone else who you have that type of connection with. That's why clients fall into this house, because they are people who you are dealing with one-on-one basis. The types of those people you can interpret through the lens of what zodiac sign is there. So you can deduce qualities about your relationships through that house. Again, another thing you can look at is who rules the 7th house, and it's Saturn. And where you find Saturn in your own chart will also tell you something about your one-on-one relationships with others. So self and other is one of the backbones or the crossroads of the chart. When you have transits to your 1st and 7th house, they are usually felt more deeply, experienced more than one of these other houses that are off the angles. So for example, if you have an eclipse that happened in your 1st or your 7th, chances are that something is going to change and begin with self or others. Types of examples, obviously, of transits to the 7th house are beginning and ending of relationships. The 7th house is also the house of open enemies, which just means that it's people who have it out for you. It's like everything is on a polarity. So if we have friends, we also have enemies, and enemies in the chart fall into the 12th house also, but 12th house is the hidden enemies. The 7th house is like frenemies, people who you know you're in opposition with, because after all, this is opposing the 1st house, but you know that somebody's out to get you in the 7th house. Things are not likely to just come out of the blue from the 7th house. It's usually things that you see coming, because the 1st house sees the 7th house. Right across, there's a clear line of sight, so it's things you're aware of. It's people you know, and it's not gonna kind of come out of the blue and just destroy your life. It's probably a relationship that you already understood to be fraud. So if you're having some kind of negative transit to your 7th house, don't worry about it, because it's probably something you can foresee or have already had a sense of or dealt with. Don't look at scary transits as like you have no control in the matter, because in the 7th house you often do have control, because it's the other side of your 1st. So it's almost like if you work on self, you will have a better time in the partnerships, very obviously. instead of going one by one, let's hit the angles first. And then once we have that, we can kind of use that as a backbone to understand the other houses. If the first house is the self you popped up here as you are, here you go, where did you come from? That is the fourth house. The fourth house is your lineage. It's your roots and anything from your physical home that you grew up in, your environment that you grew up in. And we'll talk about environment, that's a little different. That's more third house, but it could be literally your family home. It could be the things that describe your ancestors. And there are points which often, but not always, go through the 10th and the 4th house. It's the IC in the 4th house and the MC in the 10th house. These points, just like when you look across the horizon, that's very tangible. You can actually see what is rising and what is setting. There's not much controversy about that. Now, the IC and MC axis does fluctuate where we find it. If you're using whole sign house system, it will not always be in the 10th and 4th house. It may be as far as 11th, 12th, or 2nd and 8th, and that will inform something about the root and the expression of that. The 4th house being the root and the 10th house being the outward expression of your public life. I'm not going to go into how that is measured, exactly where the MC falls. Just know that you'll see it in the chart. It will give you additional information. In the Placidus system, the MC and the IC always falls between the 9th and the 10th house. Why did I write 11? You'll usually, in the Placidus chart, you'll usually see the MC, IC glued to the axis of these houses. In a whole sign system, it could vary. But what we need to know about the 4th house is that it is where you are from. It can say things about your parents, your family lineage, all the things I already mentioned. The 4th house naturally informs how you express yourself in the 10th house. So the 10th house is the, once you leave your home, what are you doing out in the world? Now, that's usually career, but since not everybody has a career, some people just are, have a different path in life where they are not super active in the public sphere. However, everybody is active to some degree. Now, this is where you can sort of look at the balance of your chart. And if you have a lot of stuff, like if you have a lot of planets down at the bottom, that will probably mean that your life will be a little more homey, a little more introverted. And then if you have more planets and things going on at the top of the chart, then you know that you're here to develop your public image, be more visible, and have that connection to outside influences and things that are connected to career and public life. Similarly, you can look at who is ruling your 4th house and what house that ruler is at, so that you can get a layer of information about your dealings in the home life and maybe like your past. And similarly, you can look at the ruler of the 10th house to give you information about where your career focus is going to be. Now, if you're looking at those and you say the ruler of the 10th is in the 1st, but I'm not a self-starter, I don't have my own business. Well, just like with transits or anything else, you may not be in the right time to unlock what the chart promises in this area. There are times in the chart where things become more activated for a specific house. This is where astrological consultations are beneficial from experienced astrologers who can point you towards those time periods when those placements are likely to become activated. And that's a very personal thing. That's why just reading your weekly horoscope that's just for all Tauruses or all Aries misses a lot of the nuance about your own specific chart, because everybody's chart is set up with a specific rising sign, which informs things that are beyond just where the sun landed. Now, where the sun landed is naturally very important because that will tell you something about your life focus overall. However, that is a very small fraction of what we could be looking at and what we could be exploring. So if you've been doing astrology and just learning some aspects about it and it's not really clicking for you, there are so many more ways to make the birth chart come alive through different timing techniques, things that will make it more relevant to yourself. To recap, 4th house is the where you came from. 10th house is the outward expression of who you are in the world. And these are very tied together because where you came from informs who you are. If you have watched the series Mad Men, we see Don Draper in the 10th house being the successful career man, living a very powerful figure who leads this, he's a sole provider for his family and he's very much respected in his office and he has a lot of power there. He has a lot of power in his personal relationships, but as the series progresses, we kind of see what is going on in his 4th house, and then that helps us understand him, his faults, and who he has tried to shed this traumatic childhood and lock that away somewhere to then have this successful public persona. But the more we see his public persona, we see how flawed it is. And then the more we understand about his 4th house, we are allowed to understand his failings due to the kind of experiences he had in his childhood and how he decided to shed that whole aspect of himself, but how it sort of is haunting him in his public life and career. That's how you can look at these houses. They are always a seesaw of those archetypes. So you can see how the 4th and the 10th and the 1st and the 7th set up the backbone of your incarnate state and how you came to be and what is the most driving archetypes that will inform your life. And because we have 3 modalities, when you look at the cross, you will see that all 4 of the signs, they are all either cardinal or mutable or fixed. So if you study what is a fixed sign, what is a cardinal sign? Well, cardinal signs, they begin, they initiate, whereas the fixed signs, they carry through that initiation, and the mutable signs are flexible to then change before the next cardinal beginning. And so when you know which type of sign you have on your angle coordinates, that informs something about how you deal with things, how you deal with these topics, how you deal with self, the home, the relationships, and your public life. For example, if you do have cardinal sign on your angles, you may be somebody who needs support in your life from somebody who can sustain. So you will begin, but you need a sphere of people who are more able to maintain that focus long term, because cardinal signs may not be always capable of pursuing that initial goal or that initial undertaking fixed signs may need to partner up with more mutable people who can change them, but not in a cardinal way, like not in a let's just quit and do this next thing, but in a gentle, changing, flowing, flexible kind of a manner. So now that we covered the angles, we can start looking at the adjacent signs. Having set up a good foundation of what the 1st, 4th, 7th, and 10th means, this should be a lot easier to understand. So if the first house is yourself, the second house is what is here for you. That's an interesting quandary because we're still talking about the world of this earth, which makes you infinitely connected to it, meaning that you need air, you need water, you need shelter to physically exist in this world. If the first house is you exist, here you are, there's all the stuff that you need to perpetuate that existence, right? Because if you're born and you don't take that first breath of air, then you cannot remain here. And so the truth of all of the things that you need here to support you is the second house. And this is why a lot of people talk about the second house in terms of money. And it's very true, because so many things in this life require money. Now, in the land and time before money, it was more like, well, what is your lot for where you were born and what kind of resources are around? Perhaps there's a fruit-bearing trees that can be harvested and processed or whatever it is. So it's money now, but it was not always money. But to understand the energy of this house is to understand what do you need to stay alive. And that could be from eating ramen noodles to having a gourmet meal 3 times a day. And this is why this house is equated with Taurus, because Taurus deals with all those things. But even though it does have a lot of crossovers with the Taurus energy, we should always focus on your own chart and what sign is on that chart for that sign's energy to inform what that house is. So there are physical things that sustain us, but there are also values, and those are not concrete. Like, what are your views about yourself? So just like you need food for sustenance, you need a form of identity that guides you through this world, and those are our values. We can look at the second house as physical stuff, but also our moral disposition. And the interesting way to see that connection very clearly is that the word valuables is close to the word values. So even though physical possessions could be beautiful objects, but they could also be our values and our honor systems. And both of those could also be corrupt. Like, you could amass a lot of things, but have no real value, have it not bring value into your life. Or vice versa, you could have a lot of virtues and beautiful, compassionate ideologies, but they are not physically doing you any good. Like you could be so generous that you give away all your possessions. I'm not trying to make a statement about whether that's good or bad, but that is the second house. So to better understand the second house, not through just your stuff, is to understand it through a holistic approach to life. Now, if that is ours, coming off the first house, the 8th house, which is the opposite, is theirs. just like the first house is us and the seventh house is the other, the second house is your stuff and the eighth house is their stuff. So you could take everything we just talked about and flip it. And then what is that? Well, that's the money of others, the values of others. It could be the money of your partner because it's coming off the seventh. It could be the collective, like taxes. You know, if you're having some transit to your eighth house, you might have to deal with taxes, paying the collective's agreed upon money. It could be debts, because when you take out money in the second house, you owe it to somebody in the eighth house. So this is the relationship between the houses. If we're talking about values, this is your values and this is the values of others. It could be the values of your partner, again coming directly off of the seventh house. It could be the values of your ancestral lineage. It could be the values of your particular culture. The other thing that the eighth house deals with is death. And I believe that is because the second house is what you need to stay here. But the eighth house being opposite day of that, well, what happens when you are done with the second? At some point, you're going to run out of all the things, like your body is at some point going to start malfunctioning, and your body is also second house because that is what you're feeding and what you're maintaining to keep it here. And the eighth house is the dissolution of that. So that's why we think about death. Now, anytime you see some negative transit coming into your eighth, don't think that it's always going to be a disaster, because the chances are that most people are here for quite a while and they'll have a lot of things happen in their eighth house. And again, like with certain timing techniques, you may be able to say when is more or less likely for something negative to actually do happen. But because of so many topics covered within one house, it's really hard to predict exactly how it's going to come out. And that's why there's not a good reason to be super concerned every single time, and just to observe and learn. For example, the moon comes around every month to every sign, and when it hits your eighth house, you're not dying every month, or you're not getting hit with some credit card bill that you can't pay, or some tax audits or something like that. So every time it will manifest differently, same as the sun comes through each house once a year. Every year it hits all of the 12 houses. Start to learn about what the major transits are bringing, but don't get super alarmed, because a lot of this stuff is not as bad as it may look when you're looking at transits. I know myself, I tend to focus a lot on the negative aspects than the positives already. So a lot of doing astrology for me has been to remain neutral and curious about what transits to these quote-unquote bad houses can bring, or things involving like malefic planets, because we do need all of those positive and negative things to have a balanced life. Just like a benefic planet such as Jupiter or Venus could have a tendency towards excess and overindulging, we need the temperance of Saturn to come in and stop certain behaviors that are getting out of hand. Or just like we need Mars, which is seen as a malefic who can like destroy and separate and burn. We need it for progress, because like you can't cut steak with a spoon, you know what I mean? Like you need Mars to get through things that otherwise a strictly Venusian archetype would not be able to. You know, you'd just be stuck like sucking on your steak or something. So the point is that we need to consider that everything that's coming to us is sort of here to propel us on the journey, and that none of it is necessarily to worry about, because if you remember going back to that infinite indestructible consciousness concept, this is all here, and we are something else also. Not that this is not important, what's going on with us right now, right here, but that there is an us that has a connection to the infinite source of all creation, and how that holds us in a way, even if we, from our small s perspective, our small self perspective, cannot always perceive that power or that level of connectedness. If we bring our attention to it, we can sort of go beyond the chart and the mundane problems and issues we're facing, or worries about an upcoming transit or something like that, and just kind of keep our big self perspective in mind especially during those times when we find ourselves dealing with 8th house topics, which are not always so positive. Now, moving on to the 3rd and the 9th, one of the ways you could look at the 3rd and the 9th house is if the 2nd is your stuff and the 8th is their stuff, the 3rd is the environment in which that stuff happens. And what is the environment? Well, the 3rd house is the local environment, such as your immediate neighborhood, the things that are happening on a regular basis that are in your immediate grasp or in your immediate surroundings. And these things are often a bit out of our control. Like, this is why siblings fall within the 3rd house, because you didn't ask for them necessarily, but here they are all the time in your space, and there's not much you could do about it. And when siblings do come in to your life, it's not always the happy celebrated thing, because with each sibling, they're kind of taking away things from your stuff and from your parents' attention and from the household. Now you may have like lost a room due to a sibling. So the 3rd house deals with things that are just around, and they're the circumstances. So if the 2nd house is like the stuff, the 3rd house is like, where is this stuff taking place on the local level? Because of that locality and sphere of things that are around, it also has to do with local travel and things that you would do, like, let's say you were producing a yearbook at your high school or something like that. Like, that's a very 3rd house. That's like a regular thing that you're doing that takes that kind of takes your local information and processes it into some kind of periodical. If you were like president of a book club, that's very much 3rd house. When people say, oh, the 3rd house is about siblings, but also about like local travel and your like primary school, you can think like, well, how are those things connected? And they are connected by virtue of the environment that you, coming off of you and going through what sustains you here, and this is like where you are on the local level. And all the things that are sort of just in the ether around where you are. Then when we go and look at the 9th house, it's the bigger version of that. So if the 3rd house is the local school that you went to or your neighborhood, the 9th house is the college, the university. If the 3rd house would include your church, for example, that you attend, but the 9th house would be that religion. So you see how the micro and the macro level are at play here. It's like if 3rd house is riding your bike to the grocery store. The ninth house is taking a plane to a different country. If the third house is studying something from a book, the ninth house is implementing that in a practice. It also has to do with religious beliefs and overarching, bigger than life ideas and hopes and dreams, and also foreigners. These are things that can manifest in these houses, but you can see the connection of how they come off the previous house and how they juxtapose each other. Moving on to the 5th and 11th. When you anchor them to the house they're next to, it starts to make a lot more sense. Again, so the 4th house is who we are and where we come from and our lineage and the literal house we grew up in and literally mom and dad. The 5th house is sort of related to the 10th. Why? Because who you are at the core and who you are in the past of your lineage informs who you are now, and that is in large part how do you express yourself. In the 10th house is how do you present in public, who are you outside the home, outside your lineage. 5th house is like it's your creative passion, which is informed by who you are at the core, which gets done at the 4th. So then in the 5th, you get to go and express who you are in some way, which will inform others of where you come from in a way also. So it's your hobbies, but it's also things that are seen more negatively, like vices, because they are an expression of your desires. And that word desire has a lot to do with a lot of different things. It could be like carnal desire for a romantic engagement. It could be a desire to play games or gamble. It could be a desire to produce a novel or artworks, any of those things. So when we look at it that way, we can understand why the 5th house deals with sexuality, it deals with romantic partners, but unlike the 7th house, these are like, they're more casual. They're like the exploration of things that may lead you into the 7th once you form a stronger bond. Once you establish a more one-on-one, like 5th house is more like a group date or something, or just that first expression of interest. And so interest and desire has a lot to do with the 5th. And desires are not always good or healthy for us, and that's why vices and certain pleasures are in the 5th house. And so if those are topics of the 5th house, what happens in the 11th? And the 11th is often seen as our acquaintances, our friends, our social network. It's because 5th house of your expression will inevitably have an audience. The 11th house is the people who will witness your 5th house activities. And that's why these are usually friends, colleagues, acquaintances. If we're talking about art, who sees your art in the 11th house? Who buys your art? If we're talking about romance, through dating people, we may expand our network. Even if it doesn't work out and we don't go with them into the 7th, we can update our Rolodex and sort of build connections maybe through their friends or through their community. Unless it turns like toxic or whatever, like most people can expand their social network in the 11th through their 5th, through 5th house topics and 5th house activities. So when you start to look at the 11th house through the lens of the other side of the 5th, all of the 5th house topics become a little more clearer, because we don't express ourselves in a vacuum. Like, what is on the other side of that expression? And that is how we influence in the greater realm of 11th, 10th, and 9th house. Like, how does our activities in the 5th, which are tied to our passion, our creativity, our wants and desires, how do they then manifest through the 11th, through the participation of others to either witness us in doing things in our 5th, or to buy our products, or to enjoy the music we create, or to support us in our community. Moving on to the final two, which is the 6th and the 12th, and these are two houses which have a negative connotation. And so if in the 5th house you are following your passions and desires and you're expressing something, well, in the 6th house you sort of get more serious and grounded about the things that are tangibly here to facilitate your expression. That could be work, and that could be the things that support the work and your physical body. But it's what we have to do on a daily basis to physically manifest our 5th house of how we want to bring things forth. And that could be kind of grueling and grinding, because let's say in the olden days, a painter, which is a 5th house thing, that's their expression and their passion, they probably would have to grind their own paint to make that happen. So like a farmer who wants to eat and produce and make a living off of that would have to have a lot of equipment and things to maintain, like livestock, tools, and they would have to follow a routine to get all of those things organized and plant at a certain time and harvest at a certain time, and know when to water and know when to take care of problems that arise. And that's all the 6th house. It's all the how of your expression that you're trying to put forth. The reason why that your body falls into this, and like, for example, going to the gym falls into this, is because that's an aspect of something you need in this incarnate existence to maintain, so that you can keep expressing yourself. Because expressing yourself and your desires are a little less here and now. They're like maybe in the mind or in the heart. And the 6th house is the actual how the sausage gets made. And so that is part of why it can be seen as negative, because eventually you kind of have to come down off that cloud. And 6th house, your dreams. Or if they fail, you have to maybe do something more practical. And that practicality and the sort of inherent failure in that potential dream of the 5th house is not that pleasant to experience. So the 6th house is like what we do to maintain the dream of being here. It could be of our desires and passions, but it could also be very mundanely working at an office and all the things that come with that, because we want to make money to do fun things in the 5th house, or because we simply want to, 2nd house, exist here on earth. So the 6th house is the grind of the things that we want to express, and that goes to our physical body maintenance routines, like hygiene stuff, diet, exercise stuff, but also maintaining your car, or if you have one, or making sure that your bills are paid on time. Those are 6th house things that if we slack off, they will come to bite us. Just like the 7th house, you know, when the 7th house is like open enemies, and you know they're coming, like you know those people don't like you. The sixth house is similar in the way that those things that go wrong in the sixth house are usually because you didn't maintain that grindy thing that's kind of annoying. Like, you didn't go to the dentist when you first noticed a problem, so 3 years later you need that tooth pulled. That's sixth house stuff. You forgot to pay a bill for a few months and now there's interest on it. Car maintenance, things like that, where it's like, if you were just on top of dealing with this, it wouldn't be a problem. And so historically, like, subordinates and cattle and pets fell into this category, sort of because pets back in the day were equipment. You had a dog to form a function, to protect, or to go hunting with you, or whatever. Same as cats, they were rarely just pets in the home, they were there to catch mice. So pets are still in the sixth house, so you can look for transits to the sixth house for your pets' health and things like that. But just know that the reason they came to be in this house because they were support animals for the things that we needed to do to survive, to make our dreams come true, right? To keep living here on Earth. Like, we needed them as much as we needed, like, I don't know, like a kitchen knife or whatever other tools to perform a specific function. Now, I know that now I feel like pets are a lot more in the fifth house, like children, and I'm not even sure if I talked about children in the fifth house, but that is definitely a huge signification of the fifth house, is children, because they're the extension of our creative being. And the fifth house is where you would look for if you had like your own physical children, or if you wanted them, you would look for fifth house, what's going on with your fifth house natally, what transits are you having to it, if it's being activated by a timing technique. Now for the 12th house, it is not unlike the sixth house that bad things can happen there, but the bad things that happen there tend to come out of the left field. They're not in a direct relationship to what we did or didn't do. The other part of the 12th house is the isolation. The 12th house rules over places that are removed. Now, these could be positive places like a monastery, like going on a retreat to take care of your mental health, which will in turn benefit your 6th house of physical health. Or it could be not maintaining your physical health and then ending up in the hospital, 12th house, for some chronic health issue, which then separates you from your immediate circle of friends and family, and where you're secluded. Jails for that same reason and prisons fall under the 12th house. Again, don't be worried too much about the 12th house because it has a lot of potential for things to be understood. It could almost be a spiritual or religious experience to have something catastrophically fail. That period of isolation and reflection could lead to something positive, a realization about what you really need to change about yourself, transmute a challenge through a severe limitation that may have come about because of something in the 6th that was not dealt with, but also just out of purely subconscious, perhaps self-sabotaging tendency that the 12th house represents. 12th house is also the sign that was rising before we were born into our first house. So it can inform a lot about where were we before we were here. That's an interesting place to explore. It's also the place of shadow work and the things that are allowed to fester until they manifest in some negative reality. And it feels like it's completely coming out of the blue, which it can and it does, but it could also be deep ancestral trauma that just keeps us in self-harm patterns. It could be chronic illnesses that keep us away from connecting with the world, because the first house is like you're plugged in, like here you are, but the 12th house is like where were you before you were manifested here, right? So it has a lot to do with maybe even your spiritual path and how that will play out in your waking state. Through virtue of that, we come back to the first and we can see how the 12th informs the first house and how we start over to the next cycle. I hope that was helpful. Thank you for watching.